Welcome to a deep dive into the world of Azure Functions interview questions and answers. Whether you're an aspiring Azure developer or an interviewer seeking to assess top talent, this comprehensive guide is your key to mastering the art of Azure Functions interviews. Get ready to unravel the intricacies of Azure Functions, gain expert insights, and confidently tackle even the most challenging questions. Let's embark on a journey to unlock the secrets of success in Azure Functions interviews. What is Azure Functions? Azure Functions is a serverless compute service provided by Microsoft Azure, allowing developers to run event-triggered code without provisioning or managing servers. What are the key features of Azure Functions? Event-driven, executes in response to various events. Serverless, no server provisioning or management required. Scalable, automatically scales based on demand. Pay-per-use, build based on the number of executions and resource consumption. Integrated, easily integrates with Azure services and third-party APIs. Explain triggers and bindings in Azure Functions. Triggers, events or conditions that start the execution of a function, such as an HTTP request, timer, or new message in a queue. Bindings, connectors that define input and output for a function, making it easier to integrate with other Azure services and external resources. What are the different types of triggers in Azure Functions? HTTP trigger, executes the function in response to an HTTP request. Timer trigger, executes the function on a predefined schedule. Azure Cosmos DB trigger, executes on new or updated documents in a Cosmos DB. Blob trigger, executes when a new blob is created or modified in Azure storage. How can you secure an Azure function? Use Azure Active Directory AAD authentication for HTTP triggers. Set up API keys for function access control. Implement role-based access control, RBC, using Azure AD for function apps. What are the deployment options for Azure Functions? Azure Portal, directly deploy and manage functions through the Azure Portal. Azure DevOps, utilize continuous integration / continuous deployment, CI/CD pipelines. Azure CLI, deploy using Azure Command Line Interface CLI. Visual Studio Code, deploy using Azure Functions extension and VS Code. ARM templates, define and deploy using Azure Resource Manager, ARM templates. Explain durable functions in Azure. Durable Functions is an extension for Azure Functions that enables the creation of stateful and orchestrator-based workflows using a set of extension methods. It facilitates long-running and stateful operations by managing the state and lifetime of functions, enabling complex coordination patterns. What are deployment slots in Azure Functions? Deployment slots are live apps with their own hostnames, allowing you to deploy different versions of your function app and swap them with the production slot seamlessly. This is useful for performing A/B testing, staged deployments, and rollback scenarios. Describe the retry policies available in Azure Functions. Exponential backoff automatically increases the delay between retries in case of transient failures. Fixed delay, retries with a fixed delay between each retry attempt. No retry, no automatic retries. How can you achieve function chaining in Azure Functions? Use output bindings. The output of one function can be used as an input to another function by using output bindings. Use durable functions. Orchestrate a sequence of functions using Durable Functions Orchestrator. What are the scaling options available for Azure Functions? Azure Functions can scale automatically based on demand. It offers two scaling options. Vertical scaling, increasing the allocated resources, CPU, memory, to a single instance of a function. Horizontal scaling, adding more function instances to handle increased load. Explain the difference between consumption plan and premium plan for Azure Functions. Consumption plan, build based on the number of executions and resource consumption. Ideal for sporadic workloads with variable traffic. Premium plan, offers more control over the underlying infrastructure, reserved instances, and virtual network integration. Suitable for enterprise-level, mission-critical applications. How can you configure environment variables in Azure Functions? Environment variables can be configured in the Azure Functions using application settings in the Azure portal. These settings can be accessed in the function code using environment.getEnvironment variable in C# or os.environ in Python. What is the maximum execution timeout for an Azure function? The maximum execution timeout for an Azure function in the consumption plan is 5 minutes. For premium and dedicated plans, it can be extended up to 60 minutes. Explain the concept of durable entities and durable functions. Durable entities are a stateful compute option in durable functions. They represent durable, virtual instances of an entity with its own state and methods. This allows you to build scalable, stateful applications in a serverless environment. How can you monitor and troubleshoot Azure Functions? Azure Functions can be monitored using Azure Application Insights or Azure Monitor. You can view logs, performance metrics, and errors in the Azure portal. For troubleshooting, you can use tools like Visual Studio Debugger, remote debugging, and exception handling in code. What are function proxies in Azure Functions? Function proxies allow you to define custom routing rules and transformations for HTTP requests and responses. They are useful for scenarios like URL rewriting, header modification, and API versioning. How can you implement durable timers and durable functions? Durable timers can be implemented using the createTimer method in a durable orchestrator function. This method allows you to schedule timers for delays or timeouts within an orchestration. What is the role of the Azure Functions runtime? The Azure Functions runtime is responsible for managing the lifecycle of function instances, including triggering, execution, and scaling. It abstracts the underlying infrastructure, allowing developers to focus on code without worrying about server management. Explain the differences between Azure Functions and Azure Logic Apps. Azure Functions, code-centric, event-driven, and serverless for custom business logic. Azure Logic Apps, workflow automation platform with a visual designer for orchestrating actions and services. What is the maximum execution timeout for a durable function orchestrator? The maximum execution timeout for a durable function orchestrator is 1 year. This allows you to create long-running, stateful workflows. How can you handle state persistence in durable functions? Durable functions automatically handle state persistence for you. The state is stored in durable storage, example, Azure Storage or Cosmos DB, and can be easily accessed within orchestrations and entities. What are the retry mechanisms available for durable functions orchestrations? Durable functions provides built-in retry mechanisms. Retry options. You can configure retry policies with options like max retry count and first retry interval. Transient fault handling. Durable functions automatically retries on transient errors like network issues. Explain the use case for the Azure Functions Premium Plan. The Azure Functions Premium Plan is designed for high-performance, mission-critical workloads. It offers features like unlimited execution duration, VNet integration, and guaranteed compute resources. Use it for applications with strict performance and security requirements. How can you trigger a function based on changes to an Azure Queue Storage message? You can use the Azure Queue Storage trigger. When a new message arrives in the specified queue, it automatically triggers the associated function. What are the benefits of using durable functions for stateful workflows? Simplified state management. Durable functions abstract away the complexities of state management, making it easier to build and maintain stateful workflows. Scalability. Durable functions can scale out to handle a large number of parallel stateful workflows. Reliable execution. Durable functions ensure reliable execution of stateful workflows even in the event of failures. Can you explain the concept of warm-up and cool-down in Azure Functions? Warm-up. Azure Functions allows you to configure warm-up scripts that run before your function app is initialized, ensuring that it's ready to handle incoming requests. Cooldown settings specify how long the app should wait before scaling in, reducing the number of instances after a period of high load. How can you secure sensitive information like connection strings in Azure Functions? Use Azure Key Vault to store and retrieve secrets securely. Configure managed identity for your function app to access Key Vault without storing credentials in code or configuration files. Explain how to implement a custom binding in Azure Functions. To implement a custom binding, you need to create a custom binding extension by defining a binding provider and a binding. This allows you to extend Azure Functions to work with new data sources or services. What are the benefits of using Azure Functions for microservices architecture? Serverless architecture reduces infrastructure management overhead. Event-driven nature makes it suitable for handling asynchronous communication between microservices. Easy integration with Azure services like Azure Service Bus and Azure Event Hubs. What is the role of Azure Functions proxies and why would you use them? Azure Functions proxies allow you to create custom API endpoints and control the routing of requests to different function apps or services. They are useful for building APIs, handling URL redirection, and transforming request/response data. Explain the concept of dependency injection in Azure Functions. Dependency injection in Azure Functions allows you to inject services and dependencies into your function code, promoting modularity and testability. It can be achieved using libraries like Azure Functions Dependency Injection or custom implementations. How can you manage and monitor the consumption of Azure Functions to control costs effectively? Use Azure Monitor and Application Insights to monitor execution and diagnose issues. Set up alerts to proactively respond to scaling or performance problems. Configure auto-scaling rules to optimize resource utilization. Implement rate limiting and quotas to control excessive usage. What are the differences between Azure Functions and Azure Web Jobs? Azure Functions is designed for serverless, event-driven computing, while Azure Web Jobs are designed for continuous and scheduled background processing. Azure Functions are more suitable for lightweight, single-purpose tasks, while Web Jobs are better for complex, long-running tasks. How can you implement retries and dead letter handling in Azure Functions that process messages from Azure Service Bus? You can implement retries and dead letter handling in Azure Functions as follows. Use the max delivery count property in Azure Service Bus to configure maximum delivery attempts. Implement retry logic within your function using try-catch blocks and custom code. Forward failed messages to a dead letter queue for manual inspection. Explain the concept of function triggers and bindings extensibility in Azure Functions. Function triggers and bindings extensibility allows you to create custom triggers and bindings for Azure Functions. This enables integration with custom data sources and events not supported out of the box, extending the capabilities of Azure Functions. What is Azure Functions Premium Plus? Azure Functions Premium Plus is a higher tier of the Premium plan, offering enhanced performance, scaling, and support for ultra-low latency scenarios. It is suitable for applications with strict real-time processing requirements. How can you handle long-running asynchronous tasks in Azure Functions? Use durable functions to orchestrate long-running workflows efficiently. Implement polling mechanisms or webhook callbacks for asynchronous tasks. Leverage queues to manage and track the progress of long-running tasks. Can you explain the concept of function proxies and how they relate to Azure Functions? Function proxies allow you to create custom API endpoints and route requests to different Azure functions or external services. They provide URL rewriting, request/response transformation, and security features. Function proxies are often used to create API gateways for Azure Functions. What are the advantages of using Azure Functions in a multi-cloud or hybrid cloud environment? Azure Functions can be integrated with other Azure services, making it easier to build hybrid solutions. They are platform agnostic, which means you can run them on various cloud providers or on-premises using Azure Stack. Event-driven architecture enables seamless communication between on-premises and cloud components. How can you manage and monitor Azure Functions in a production environment? Use Azure Application Insights for end-to-end monitoring, logging, and diagnostics. Configure alerts and notifications for key performance indicators. Set up Application Insights Profiler to analyze function app performance. What is the purpose of function apps in Azure Functions? Function apps provide a logical grouping for Azure Functions and allow you to manage multiple functions as a single unit. They are used to organize and deploy related functions together. Can you explain the differences between Azure Functions and AWS Lambda? Azure Functions, Microsoft Azure Serverless Compute Service. AWS Lambda, Amazon Web Services Serverless Compute Service. Both provide similar functionality, but differences exist in pricing, language support, and integrations with their respective cloud ecosystems. How can you handle and retry transient errors in Azure Functions that interact with external services? Implement retry logic with exponential backoff for handling transient errors. Leverage circuit breaker patterns to prevent repeated retries in case of prolonged failures. Use appropriate exception handling mechanisms and log errors for analysis. What are the limitations of Azure Functions and how can you work around them? Some limitations include execution timeout, maximum memory, and maximum payload size. Workarounds may involve breaking large tasks into smaller functions, optimizing code, and considering premium or dedicated plans for increased resources. Explain how you can implement security best practices for Azure Functions. Use Azure AD for authentication and authorization of HTTP triggers. Employ managed identity for secure access to Azure resources. Implement role-based access control, RBC, for fine-grained permissions. Regularly update and patch dependencies to address security vulnerabilities. What is the Azure Functions Premium Plan's advantage over the consumption plan for mission-critical applications? The Premium Plan provides dedicated compute resources, unlimited execution duration, VNet integration. How can you handle secrets and sensitive data, such as API keys in Azure Functions securely? Store secrets in Azure Key Vault and access them using managed identity. Use Azure Key Vault references in application settings for seamless integration. Avoid hard-coding secrets in code or configuration files. What is the relationship between Azure Functions and Azure Logic Apps? Azure Functions can be used within Azure Logic Apps as custom actions, allowing you to execute custom code in response to events in your Logic App workflow. This provides flexibility in building workflows with serverless compute capabilities. Explain how you can implement versioning for Azure Functions APIs. Use URL versioning by including version information in the URL path. Employ HTTP headers like accept or API version to specify the version. Maintain separate function apps or proxies for different versions if necessary. What is the difference between a function and a function app in Azure Functions? A function is a single unit of code that performs a specific task. A function app is a collection of one or more related functions, configurations, and resources that are deployed together. How can you ensure high availability and fault tolerance for Azure Functions? Deploy Azure Functions in multiple regions for geographic redundancy. Use Azure Traffic Manager for DNS-based load balancing. Implement retry and circuit breaker patterns in your code to handle failures gracefully. What are the key components of an Azure Functions application? An Azure Functions application consists of functions code, triggers and bindings, event sources and data connections, function app settings, configuration, external resources like databases, queues, and storage accounts. Explain how to handle secrets and connection strings securely in Azure Functions. Store secrets and connection strings in Azure Key Vault. Use managed identity to access Azure Key Vault secrets. Reference secret values from Key Vault in your function app settings. What is the difference between durable and stateless Azure functions? Durable functions maintain state and orchestration in long-running workflows. Stateless functions are stateless and typically handle short-lived, stateless tasks. How can you implement authentication and authorization for HTTP-triggered Azure functions? Use Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, authentication for securing HTTP triggers. Implement custom authentication middleware if needed. Leverage Azure Functions proxies for API security and routing. Explain the difference between synchronous and asynchronous Azure functions. Synchronous functions execute in response to a trigger and return a response immediately. Asynchronous functions can start a task that runs independently and doesn't block the main execution. What is an Azure Functions Application Insights integration and why is it useful? Azure Functions can be integrated with Application Insights to collect telemetry data, monitor performance, and troubleshoot issues in real time. It provides deep insights into the behavior and health of your Functions application. How can you secure Azure Functions using Azure Active Directory AAD? Configure AAD authentication for your function app. Define app roles and permissions in AAD. Use AAD tokens to authorize users and control access to functions. Can you explain how to implement custom error handling and logging in Azure Functions? Use try-catch blocks in your code to catch exceptions and log errors. Configure Azure Application Insights or other logging providers for detailed error tracking. Utilize structured logging to capture context and diagnostic information. What are the advantages of using Azure Functions for real-time processing of data streams? Azure Functions can be triggered by Azure Stream Analytics, Azure Event Hubs, or IT Hub events for real-time data processing. They provide a serverless and scalable way to analyze and react to streaming data. How can you configure custom domain names for Azure Functions? Configure custom domain names for your function app using Azure Functions proxies or Azure Front Door. Associate the custom domain with the function app's public IP address. What are the differences between Azure Functions and Azure Logic apps in terms of workflow automation? Azure Functions are code-centric and allow for more custom, fine-grained logic. Azure Logic apps provide a visual workflow designer and are better suited for business process automation. Explain how you can implement retry policies for Azure Functions triggered by external services. Utilize Azure Functions built-in retry policies and specify retry options in function bindings. Implement custom retry logic within your function code using exponential backoff or other strategies. What is the purpose of deployment slots in Azure Functions and how can they be used effectively? Deployment slots allow you to stage and test function app changes before deploying them to production. They can be used for A/B testing, blue-green deployments, and rollback scenarios without affecting the live production environment. How can you implement input and output bindings for Azure Functions in Python? Input and output bindings in Python are specified in the function.json file. You can use decorators like @blob_input and @blob_output for blob bindings and similar decorators for other bindings. Explain how you can trigger Azure Functions using Azure Logic apps. Azure Logic apps can use the Azure Functions connector to trigger functions. You can specify the function name, method, and payload to trigger a specific function when a Logic app workflow runs. What are durable entities and how can they be used in durable functions? Durable entities are a stateful and scalable programming model within durable functions. They represent stateful objects that can be accessed and manipulated by multiple functions, allowing for complex coordination patterns. How can you implement unit testing for Azure Functions code? Use testing frameworks like XUnit or PyTest for Python to write unit tests. Mock dependencies or use test environments to isolate the function being tested. Verify the expected behavior of your functions by testing different input scenarios. Explain how to configure custom authorization for Azure Functions HTTP triggers. Implement custom authentication middleware to validate authorization tokens or headers. Use Azure Functions proxies for API gateway features and custom authorization logic. How can you secure data at rest and in transit for Azure Functions and associated resources? Use Azure Storage Service encryption to secure data at rest. Utilize HTTPS for data in transit and configure SSL certificates if needed. Implement Azure Private Link to keep resources on a private network. What is the maximum execution timeout for durable functions orchestrations and entities? Durable functions orchestrations can run for up to 1 year. Durable entities don't have a timeout limit since they represent stateful objects. Explain the concept of Azure Functions proxies and how they help in API management. Azure Functions proxies allow you to create API gateways by defining custom routing rules, transformations, and security settings. They are useful for consolidating multiple functions or APIs under a single endpoint, handling versioning, and applying custom logic. How can you achieve data consistency in Azure Functions when interacting with multiple Azure services? Use transactions supported by Azure Storage or Cosmos DB when dealing with data that requires strong consistency. Implement idempotent operations in retries for eventual consistency. What is the purpose of host.json in Azure Functions, and how can you use it to configure host-level settings? Host.json is a configuration file used to specify host-level settings for a function app. You can configure settings like function timeout, logging, and default values for triggers and bindings in host.json. How can you monitor and trace function execution for debugging and troubleshooting? Utilize Application Insights or Azure Monitor to collect telemetry data. Implement structured logging and custom logging providers to capture relevant information. Use Visual Studio or VS Code extensions for local debugging. Explain how Azure Functions can be integrated with Azure Event Grid. Azure Functions can be triggered by events published to Azure Event Grid topics. This integration allows you to react to a wide range of events from Azure services and custom sources. How can you implement rate limiting for Azure Functions to prevent abuse or overuse of resources? Use Azure API Management for comprehensive rate limiting, throttling, and API governance. Implement custom rate limiting logic within your functions using counters or timers. What are the benefits of using Azure Functions in a microservices architecture? Azure Functions are well suited for implementing microservices due to their event-driven, scalable nature. They can handle individual microservices tasks, such as data processing, authentication, and background processing. How can you handle long-running processes that require user interaction in Azure Functions? Use durable functions to orchestrate long-running processes that involve user interaction. Implement user-friendly notifications like email or mobile push notifications to guide users through the process. What are the best practices for securing Azure Functions against common web application vulnerabilities, such as SQL injection and cross-site scripting (XSS)? Use input validation and parameterized queries to prevent SQL injection. Sanitize and validate user input to mitigate cross-site scripting (XSS) vulnerabilities. Implement Content Security Policy (CSP) headers to control resource loading. Explain how you can achieve idempotence in Azure Functions and why it's important. Idempotence ensures that performing an operation multiple times has the same result as performing it once. To achieve idempotence in Azure Functions, design your functions to handle duplicate requests gracefully, such as by using unique identifiers or checking the current state before executing. How can you ensure proper error handling and retry mechanisms for Azure Functions that interact with external APIs? Implement proper exception handling to catch errors and provide informative error messages. Configure retry policies for HTTP requests using libraries like Poly. Use Azure Functions durable timers for delayed retries. Explain the concept of fan-out/fan-in patterns in durable functions and give an example use case. Fan-out/fan-in is a pattern where multiple tasks are executed in parallel, fan-out, and their results are combined or aggregated, fan-in. Example, in an e-commerce system, you may fan out to multiple inventory check functions to verify product availability and then fan in to calculate the total available quantity. How can you optimize the cold start performance of Azure Functions? Use the Azure Functions Premium plan to reduce cold start times. Enable Always On in the App Service plan settings. Implement singleton patterns to reuse resources across invocations where applicable. Explain the concept of dependency injection and its advantages in Azure Functions. Dependency injection is a design pattern that allows you to inject dependencies, example, services, configurations, into your functions rather than hard coding them. Advantages include improved testability, modularity, and flexibility in changing dependencies without modifying the code. How can you implement custom monitoring and telemetry in Azure Functions using application insights or other logging tools? Instrument your functions with custom telemetry events using Application Insights SDK or other logging libraries. Log key application events, metrics, and context information. Use telemetry data to gain insights into the behavior and performance of your functions. What is the purpose of cross-origin resource sharing CORS, and how can you configure it for Azure Functions with HTTP triggers? CORS is a security feature that controls which web domains can make requests to your API. To configure CORS for Azure Functions, you can specify allowed origins, methods, and headers in the function app settings or by using Azure Functions proxies. Explain how to handle long-running, stateful processes in Azure Functions without using durable functions. Implement a design pattern like polling or saga to manage state and coordination between functions. Use external storage, example, Azure Storage, Cosmos DB, to persist and share state across function invocations. What are the key differences between Azure Functions and Azure App Service for hosting web applications? Azure Functions are designed for serverless, event-driven functions, while Azure App Service is designed for hosting full web applications. Functions are more suited for microservices, background processing, and single-purpose tasks, whereas App Service is for hosting entire web apps and APIs. How can you handle secrets and configuration settings in Azure Functions that differ between development, staging, and production environments? Use environment-specific configurations and settings in your Azure Function app settings. Leverage Azure Key Vault to store sensitive secrets and access them based on the environment. Explain how you can implement asynchronous communication between Azure Functions. Use Azure Storage Queues or Service Bus Queues/topics to facilitate asynchronous communication between functions. Functions can enqueue messages to a queue or subscribe to messages in a topic, allowing for decoupled and asynchronous processing. What are the considerations for managing long-term state in Azure Functions, especially when dealing with stateful workflows that span multiple days or weeks? Durable Functions is the preferred option for managing long-term state, as it provides built-in state management and orchestration capabilities. For workflows that exceed Durable Functions' 1-year timeout limit, consider breaking them into smaller, shorter orchestrations or using external state management solutions like databases. Explain the advantages of using Azure Functions with Azure Kubernetes Service (AKS) in a containerized environment. Azure Functions for Containers allows you to run functions within Docker containers. This enables the use of custom dependencies, libraries, and runtime versions. You can leverage Azure Kubernetes Service (AKS) for scaling, orchestration, and managing containers. How can you ensure data consistency when multiple Azure functions need to update the same resource simultaneously? Use distributed locking mechanisms like Azure Blob Leases or Azure Redis Cache to ensure exclusive access to shared resources. Implement optimistic concurrency control to detect and handle conflicts when multiple functions update the same resource. What is the purpose of an Azure Functions application settings file, local.settings.json, in local development, and how does it differ from production settings? Local.settings.json is used for configuring settings in the local development environment. It typically contains connection strings, secrets, and other environment-specific configurations. In production, these settings are stored in Azure Function App Settings. How can you automate the deployment of Azure Functions using infrastructure as code, IAC, or DevOps practices? Use Azure Resource Manager, ARM, templates, or Terraform to define and deploy the Azure Function infrastructure. Implement continuous integration/continuous deployment, CI/CD, pipelines in Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions, or other CI/CD tools. Explain how you can set up testing and load testing for Azure Functions to ensure they meet performance and reliability requirements. Use load testing tools like Apache JMeter or Azure DevOps load testing to simulate high loads and identify performance bottlenecks. Implement unit testing, integration testing, and end-to-end testing for function logic. What are the advantages and considerations of using Azure Functions for event-driven serverless computing over traditional server-based architectures? Advantages include reduced infrastructure management, cost savings, automatic scaling, and a pay-as-you-go pricing model. Considerations include cold start times, execution duration limits, and potential challenges with stateful workflows. Can you explain the concept of fan-in/fan-out patterns in durable functions and provide an example use case? Fan-in/fan-out is a pattern where multiple tasks are executed in parallel, fan-out, and their results are combined or aggregated, fan-in. Example, in a data processing pipeline, you may fan out to multiple data processors to parallelize work, and then fan in to consolidate results. Explain the concept of distributed tracing and how it can be implemented in Azure Functions for monitoring and troubleshooting. Distributed tracing is a technique used to track the flow of requests across different services and components in a distributed system. To implement distributed tracing in Azure Functions, you can use tools like Application Insights or OpenTelemetry to instrument your functions and gather trace data. This data allows you to visualize the entire request flow and identify performance bottlenecks or errors.
Hey, if you like the content, please subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a bite of Azure brilliance.